And I think that where people aren't able to admit is that they are willing to overlook anti-Black harm and violence because they want a good time. They want to listen to the music and they want to. So like, that's where I think I just want us to be honest with ourselves, y'all. I want us to just be like, this is what it is. I'm willing to overlook all the anti-Black harm because my favorite artist is playing. It's me, Jay Nice on the mic. I'm back. So this video is inspired by a LinkedIn post that I made, which I will pop on the screen here. And this post, as of recording this, there were 41,000 impressions on the post. It's interesting because usually I'm a LinkedIn girly, so I know a lot about the metrics. And for me, when I get a post that gets this much visibility, usually it has 200, 300, 400 reactions, right? This post had maybe 60 or 70 reactions, which lets me know people have seen the post, but they're just not engaging with it because they disagree. And the main premise of the post was that I feel like I don't think Bad Bunny should have performed at the Super Bowl. And a lot of people disagreed with me, and I wanted to talk about that because I also feel like there's tie-ins with my new book, Rise and Resist, where I studied 32 Black people globally who've resisted. And I talked about their legacies of resistance and what we can learn from their legacies of resistance in today's day and age. And so I wanted to first give us, to ground the conversation, I wrote down a definition of resistance. This is from a Science Direct article, right, where that studied resistance, and they define resistance as broadly understood as the political and cultural struggles carried out by social actors to challenge dominant workings of power. That is really important, and I'll read that again: to challenge dominant workings of power. Resistance can be organized and highly visible, or can be more subtle and take place as part of practices of everyday life. And I talked about behind the scenes resistance because I think in this day and age, that's the most powerful form of resistance that we can engage in, is resistance that is behind the scenes, that is not out in the open, because we don't have the privilege of being overt in 2026. Everything is being surveilled and tracked and monitored, so we have to be more clandestine with our resistance efforts. So the reason that I feel like Bad Bunny should have refused the Super Bowl is plentiful, right? I've talked about how problematic the NFL is in previous articles that I've written, but just off the top of the head, 4 reasons why I feel like the NFL is problematic. A, they engaged in race norming practices where they used intelligence tests that said that Black people had lower intelligence than our counterparts. And what this did is it made it more difficult for retired Black NFL players to prove that they had cognitive brain decline, because based on these tests, we have lower intelligence, and so they had a higher burden of proof to prove that they actually experienced mental decline. And the NFL did this to avoid compensating these Black players. That was number 1. Number 2, we all see how they did with Colin Kaepernick and how they blackballed him, right? And I stand with Colin Kaepernick. Number 3, Brian Flores was a former head coach in the NFL, and in 2022, he sued them because he said that they conducted sham interviews. We know that the NFL has a Rooney Rule in place, and the Rooney Rule basically says something like they have to interview head coach, non-white head coaches, right? Because the NFL has a problem where most of the players, as we know, are Black, but the majority of the head coaches are not Black, are white. And so to address this systemic issue, they put the Rooney Rule in place, which basically said that they had to interview people of the global majority, right? And Brian Flores alleges that even though they have the Rooney Rule in place, that they were conducting sham interviews, which is the same exact thing that Wells Fargo was engaged in, where during the height of DEI in post 2025, post the murder of George Floyd, a lot of companies were doing like performative DEI to look like they were actually doing something. And Wells Fargo was also called out for doing the same thing, where they did sham interviews. Even though they knew they wanted to hire certain people, they were interviewing people of the global majority, people of color, to look like they were actually engaged in DEI practices, when in actuality, they already knew who they wanted to hire. And I think in most cases, it was not a person of the global majority. So in 2026, I read that the lawsuit that Brian Flores is suing the NFL for is not just, so he's alleging racial discrimination in hiring and retention. So the NFL, according to his claims, did not do enough or are not doing enough to make sure that they're hiring a diverse set of candidates, and they're not doing anything to retain these candidates. So he's alleging discrimination in hiring and retention, and that the NFL conducted sham interviews. And in 2026, this case is supposed to go to court or play out somehow in court. So I'm gonna be watching. But those are three things. And the fourth reason why I'm not a fan of the NFL is that there are so many women that have alleged or claimed that coaches, players, and people affiliated with the NFL have engaged in sexual misconduct, and they received a slap on the wrist. We all remember Ray Rice and how we saw that elevator video where he was engaged in abuse and harm to his partner, and he got a slap on the wrist. And there's so many stories of this. And so the NFL sweeps these types of domestic abuse, especially when it comes to women, reporters and journalists and cheerleaders and women being harmed by people affiliated with the NFL, get a slap on the wrist. And so because of these four reasons, I am not a fan of the NFL. And I think Bad Bunny, being somebody who is anti-establishment, somebody who has used his music to push back against dominant norms in his music. I read, because I don't speak Spanish, but I read about his most recent album. So Bad Bunny is somebody who has used his music to talk about the empire. He uses his music, I was reading about his lyrics, and he's talked about gentrification in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico's need for self-determination and statehood, gentrification, how Puerto Rico has been treated by, so Bad Bunny discusses all of these really important themes of just the empire and what his culture and what Puerto Rico means to him and what it represents. And so he's been very sort of revolutionary in the music that he's created. I thought it was powerful that he said he is not going to perform on the mainland US because he knows that many of his fans are Latin American and they were going to be targeted by ICE. I would have expected him to turn down partnering with such a problematic institution like the NFL. And so I got into a really heated debate about this. And I should have prefaced this by saying I don't watch the Super Bowl, I don't watch the NFL, and I just saw clips, right, online. I didn't see the J-Lo and Shakira performance. I've actually been a huge Shakira fan. So I lived in the Middle East. I don't know if I've ever shared this on my YouTube channel, but I've shared this online before. But my family used to live in the Middle East, and when we lived there, my dad actually bought me a Shakira album, and that was my first time listening to her. I was not familiar with her. I didn't know any Spanish. I don't know any Spanish, but it was the Donde Estás los Ladrones album, Where Are the Thieves, I believe is what that translates to. And I loved Shakira, and that's when I found out, Shakira was Colombian and half Lebanese. So she had a song where she sung in Arabic. I don't know if she knows Arabic, but of course she was big in Latin America, in South America, and among Spanish speakers. Shakira was really big back then. This was before Laundry. I forget what her Laundry album is. I love Shakira, right? I'm a huge Shakira fan. Her first English album in 2003-ish or 2002, Laundry Service, I forget what it was called, but that's when she went blonde and all of that. I say all this to say I didn't expect Shakira, who is South American and Arab, to come to the Super Bowl and do this whole celebration of Latin American culture. And we know J-Lo is very far removed from, yes, she's a New Yorican, But like, I don't know if and Latin Americans, you can come in the comments and correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if she embodies the Latin American culture the way Bad Bunny does. And so even though J-Lo and Shakira have performed at the Super Bowl, even though we had Cardi's more like ingratiated in black culture. So I don't know if Cardi or J-Lo or Shakira or any of the other Spanish artists that came to the Super Bowl, I can't think of who any of the rest of them were. I think those are the three main ones. I don't think that they embodied Latin American culture the way Bad Bunny did. And so a lot of people were saying to me, this is the first time the Latin Americans were really represented, and this is the first time that we truly felt represented. But my argument is that I don't think representation leads to change. Like, I think that if we're just pacified by seeing ourselves represented, nothing is actually going to change within these harmful and oppressive systems. I personally think that if Bad Bunny refused the Super Bowl and created a visual about why he's refusing the Super Bowl and how ICE has been terrorizing people and how, you know, people from Latin America, Puerto Ricans who are citizens, are being targeted, and how oppressive this regime is, that would have sent a more powerful message. I actually think he should have refused the Super Bowl, posted an open letter about why, maybe even dropped an album the day the Super Bowl was releasing, along with visuals. And he should have done all of this to send a really, really powerful message. I would have supported him. Even though I don't speak Spanish and I can't understand the music, I would have just downloaded and supported just because of that. So in Rise and Resist, I wrote about the different types of resistance and the different ways that Black people have resisted throughout history. And a lot of what the discourse I've been seeing online when it comes to Bad Bunny is that people say joy is an act of resistance, and this presentation or this Super Bowl performance was a way to celebrate the culture, and it was very revolutionary and it was very radical. I don't know if anybody called it radical, but it was an act of resistance. And I just had to throw in my 2 cents, because as somebody who wrote a book that is coming out February 24th on resistance, and on Black resistance specifically, I think that there were better ways for him to resist than aligning with an institution that is oppressive and has caused so much harm. Right? To go back to the definition of resistance can be broadly understood as the political and cultural struggles carried out by social actors to challenge dominant workings of power. Do y'all think that performing for an institution that is harmful and oppressive was challenging dominant workings of power? I would say no. So in the book, Rise and Resist, I talked about the different ways that Black people have resisted. And one of the things I talked about was documentation as resistance, and how Black people throughout history, like Ida B. Wells, have documented the harm that people have experienced, right? She wrote a Red Record, where she provided a record of all of the Black people in the 1800s that had been lynched. And that was powerful. That was an archive of a snapshot of what was happening. To me, it would have been really powerful if Bad Bunny created like visuals of what is actually happening to Latin American people in this country, right? And that would have been like a snapshot or an archive. And for somebody of his status, somebody who was the most streamed artist of 2025 globally, right? I think that would have been powerful. In a debate that I was having about this with somebody said to me, white people don't know who Bad Bunny is. And by being on the Super Bowl, he increased his visibility. He increased more people knowing about him. And I just think that that's so silly, because I think that we shouldn't do things based on the dominant culture, or we shouldn't do things to appease the dominant culture. If the only reason he should have performed was so more people knew who he was, I just don't think that the right move. And I think that there were better ways to push back against the dominant power structures than performing within those same structures. I think that he could have documented what is happening in the form of his music and his videos, just like he's been doing. And I think that that is something that many Black folks have done throughout history, where they've documented. I made a video about documentation as resistance that I will link over here, but there's so many Black people who've documented the harms that Black people have been experiencing. And I think that that is a powerful way to resist, because the regime is trying to warp history and trying to make us think that these things aren't really happening or they're not that bad. And so I think that that could have been a way that he could resist, is instead of participating in the system, creating art about what is happening. And he's already done that. Someone might say, well, he already did that in his album. But I think that he could have continued to do that and said, I don't want to participate in an institution that is just an arm of the state. I don't want to participate in an institution that is actively causing harm to people. He didn't need the visibility. And I wrote that in my LinkedIn post, and people were arguing with me and saying this put him in front of more audiences. But I think everything is rooted in a white measuring stick, and everything is like, well, more white people will know who he is, right? Because that's what people are really saying. And it's like, you don't need bro, you are the #1 global artist in the world, according to Spotify. You don't need the visibility. And I would argue that if he said, I don't want to do this, I refuse, his refusal would have been such a powerful form of resistance. And I talk about refusals in this book, not to bring it back, but y'all, I literally studied resistance. And I think that, again, my argument is that there were more powerful ways to resist than performing for the establishment. And I think that we have to really be honest with ourselves. I am somebody, I love me some Beyonce. I love Rihanna. I know that they are billionaires. I don't think there's such a thing as ethical billionaires. And I'm somebody that believes that all of these oppressive systems, including capitalism, have to be dismantled. But I have to operate within the system. And I am okay with saying, I know that being a supporter of billionaire celebrities is contradictory, and it is like I live with that cognitive dissonance. But I can be honest with myself and say, I know it's problematic and I should not be supporting these people. Where my problem lies is that many people aren't being honest with themselves. They're willing to overlook all of the harm that the NFL has caused to Black people, to women, and to other marginalized people, because their favorite artist is playing. And if that's the case, just say that. But a lot of people are trying to say that the halftime performance is something that is just isn't. And I think we have to really be honest with ourselves. And I really think that dismantling these systems of oppression that are harming all of us requires honesty, requires us to acknowledge and recognize the ways that we are upholding systems of oppression. And we can't be hiding behind the guise of cultural appreciation and a celebration of diversity, because at the end of the day, celebrating diversity and representation is not going to change the material reality of Latin American people and Black people and so many people who are being terrorized by the system. And so I just think we have to really be honest with ourselves. And I think that where people aren't able to admit is that they are willing to overlook anti-Black harm and violence because they want a good time. They want to listen to the music and they want to. So like, that's where I think I just want us to be honest with ourselves, y'all. I want us to just be like, this is what it is. I'm willing to overlook all the anti-Black harm because my favorite artist is playing. I would have more respect for people who just were able to admit that. In my book, I talked about how one of the ways that Black people have resisted is creating alternative systems. I talked about Timnit Gebru, who is the Habesha researcher she's an AI researcher who worked at Google, who was ousted from Google, and she created her own alternate structure, and how that's one of the ways that we can resist. And I just wish that Bad Bunny would have done that instead. If he chose to turn down the Super Bowl, I guess there have been other people that have turned down the Super Bowl. I think I read Taylor Swift did. I don't know why she did. because she'd be going to the Super Bowls. But if he had turned it down and provided like a reason as to why, I think it would have sparked more conversation. On my LinkedIn post, somebody said that Bad Bunny performing at the Super Bowl opened up conversations between her and her coworkers. Assumably, I think her coworkers are Latin American, and this person that wrote this was a Black woman. And I said, but imagine how much conversation would have been started if he had turned it down. But I think it would have brought more visibility and awareness to the issues that he's trying to raise awareness for. I think it also puts public pressure on the country. Back when Emmett Till was brutally murdered, his mother, Mamie Till, decided to have an open casket funeral, and Jet Magazine posted a picture of Emmett Till's mutilated body for the world to see. And I think that historians say that this was one of the main catalysts to the civil rights movement, because when you see the brutality of that photo of Emmett Till and his body, his face is so badly mutilated, you can't even tell that it's him. That puts pressure on the powers that be, because yes, these people are harmful and oppressive, but they don't want to be called out. And when they're being called out, as we call them out more, it puts more pressure on them. So I think that it would have, refusing to perform could have put pressure on the powers that be. And I also think it could have put pressure on like sponsors and advertisers, because if this powerful artist, who's the #1 streamed artist on Spotify, is doing this, maybe I might worry, if I have a business and I have an ad that's going up on the Super Bowl, I might worry that my clients may boycott if I chose to pay the NFL for an ad spot, right? And so I think that there are several things that not performing could have done. And I argue that these things would have been more transformative than deciding to perform. What's going to happen is we're going to talk about this performance for another week, and then things are going to go off into obscurity and we're not going to talk about it anymore. And all of the cultural diversity and the representation is not going to lead to systemic changes, and it's not going to stop the harm that is coming to people that look like Bad Bunny and who are Puerto Rican and who are Latin American and who are Black folks and all of that. So another argument that came up when I was having a debate with someone is, this person said two things that I think require more thought and examination. This person said, the NFL has made more millionaires than any other industry. I don't know how true that is, but my rebuttal to that was, the making of millionaires isn't stopping systemic harm. The presence of millionaires, two things can be true. Maybe the NFL has made a lot of millionaires, but Black people and Latin American people and everybody is suffering under these oppressive systems. So making millionaires is not stopping the harm that you're also causing. And it doesn't negate or cross out the harm that you've caused, right? Millionaires are still getting CTE and other traumatic brain injuries and degenerative brain conditions, and are still being mistreated within the system. So this person was saying, do you know how many people got out of poverty and the NFL helped them provide for their families? And I'm like, what good is that if they're not even trying to pay you out if you get CTE? And on top of that, to complicate matters more, up until 2025, most quarterbacks in the NFL were white. And I just learned this, that the quarterback position is less head trauma, right? It's less of a harsh position, and it's by design that most of the people that we know about who are famous quarterbacks are white. It's a position that gives you a form of safety and protection that some of the other positions don't give you. And last year, 2025, was the first year that the NFL had 16 Black quarterbacks, and I guess that's half of the NFL team. So 50% of the NFL now consists of Black quarterbacks, which is like monumental. But all of these things are important to consider. And I don't think that making of millionaires absolves you of the harm that you've caused. Another conversation that came up was this person I was having a debate with said, At what point do we forgive institutions that cause harm? And then also this person said, and all corporations have caused harm, so where do we draw the line? Right? But going back to the question of at what point do we forgive institutions for harm? As somebody who does equity work in organizations and institutions, this is a really tricky question. And I actually think I'm going to make a whole video about this question because it's an important question. I don't think there's a one size fits all answer, but I do think that there has to be changes that are made. Progress, a little tiny bit of progress is not enough, right? So this person said, well, the NFL, I guess they got new protective equipment, so the helmets have more padding, so that players are less likely to get CTE. Also, the NFL hired Jay-Z to do their halftime shows. To me, hiring Jay-Z is not changing the systemic issues. I would want to see more head coaches being hired and retained. I would like to hear from the head coaches who are non-white about their experiences in the NFL. I would love to see more non-white head coaches being hired and retained. I would love to hear the experiences of the players. I would love to see the data about whether CTE is actually going down after they've implemented. And I know it's hard because I think they just implemented this new equipment. But I would love to hear from the women who have experienced harm. You know, I want to see, have the instances of harm against women journalists, against writers, against cheerleaders, has that number gone down, right? Those to me are all indicators that that we can start to forgive an institution. But I do think it's a really important question of at what point do we forgive, right? Because like this person was like, yeah, but are you going to hate the NFL forever? And it's like, I want to see them do better. And I don't think, as somebody who is an outsider, I don't think that they are somebody that has demonstrated yet to me that they have changed. It's tough because as somebody that is a proponent of abolition, I think that all these systems are corrupt and should be torn down. Right? And I think in an ideal world, all these corporations and institutions would be abolished and would be done away with. But I think like in the meantime, I do think that there are ways that we can transform the systems, right? Because I know that the practicality perhaps and the feasibility of just abolishing everything, someone might watch this and say, okay, that's not going to happen tomorrow. What do we do right now? And I think right now, there are concrete things that I would want to see from an institution like the NFL, where I want to see more non-white people not just being hired. How are they being treated? How are they being, how are players, what are you doing to ensure that players are safe? Right? So I think that those are immediate things that the NFL should do right now because they have so much money to invest in all of these other things that aren't really moving the needle. The other thing that was brought up in this conversation was, somebody said to me, well, all corporations and institutions are causing harm. If you're going to boycott the NFL, you actually have to boycott all of these other institutions. And this was the same thing that people said to me when in 2023, I said I was boycotting Starbucks. A lot of it is about small little things that we can as individuals do in our lives. If everybody thought there's no point in boycotting and protesting because everybody is causing harm and every institution is causing harm, nothing would ever change. I do think boycotting is making a difference. We see what's happening with Target. And so I do think that protesting and boycotting is powerful. And if we can do what we can in our lives to not contribute to or uphold systems that are causing harm, I do think that that is making a difference. Author Rennie Ito Lodge, who is an amazing Black British author, she wrote the book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Racism. But in her book, she said this really powerful line, which I always quote, where she said, every voice raised up against racism chips away at its power. And I truly believe that everything we do that is pushing back against these oppressive systems does make a difference, even though it may feel like it doesn't. So, those are my thoughts. I would love to know y'all's thoughts. And if you want to learn more about the long legacy of resistance, please pick up my new book, pre-order my new book, Rise and Resist. So that is where I'm going to leave off today's video. Thank y'all so much for watching, and I will check y'all out in the next video.